The target on the morning of August 16 was the Bordeaux region of France. This was a mission of high strategic importance, neutralizing the crucial U-boat repair facilities and the nearby German airfields that threatened Allied shipping. These deep penetration raids were notorious. They required long hours over hostile territory and guaranteed a vicious welcome from highly trained Luftwaffe fighter squadrons and the dense, concentrated curtain of German anti-aircraft artillery, the dreaded flak. Among the thousands of aircraft lifting off from the sprawling airbases of East Anglia was a single, sturdy, yet boxy-looking B-24 Liberator. This was the workhorse of the American bomber fleet, known for its long range, heavy payload, and distinctive, twin-tailed appearance. This particular plane bore the defiant name, painted in bold letters across its nose, the Texas Terror. In the pilot's seat was First Lieutenant Arthur J. Sumners. Sumners wasn't just a pilot, he was a representative of the best of the 8th Air Force's officer corps. Decorated for prior missions, intensely disciplined, and possessed of a calm, almost unnerving self-possession, he was exactly the kind of man required to hold steady a 10-man crew through the 7-hour ordeal of a deep raid. From his Texas origins, he carried a reputation for meticulous planning and unflappable resolve, a quality that was about to be tested to its absolute limit. Sumners, however, was carrying far more than his crew and his bomb load. He was a highly trained officer carrying confidential information and, crucially, a piece of equipment essential to the Allied strategic plan. This was the unadvertised weight pressing down on his shoulders, a silent, constant mandate that superseded the conventional rules of combat. The hammer blow of the flak. The flight to the target was long and tense, but it was over the target itself that chaos erupted. The German flak batteries defending the Bordeaux naval complex were infamous for their accuracy and concentration. As the Texas Terror entered the firing zone, the air around the Liberator instantly transformed into a black, smoke-filled cloud, laced with the metallic whine of shrapnel. The noise inside the cockpit was unimaginable, a continuous, percussive hammering that sounded, as one veteran famously described it, like a giant throwing buckets of gravel at a tin roof. The crew strained against their harnesses, shouting warnings into their microphones, trying to maintain composure as the plane shuddered violently. Then came the catastrophic hit. It was a burst, perfectly timed and placed, exploding directly beneath the starboard wing. The resulting impact felt like the plane had struck a stone wall. The entire B-24 was violently thrown sideways, forcing Sumners to fight the heavy controls. A piercing, metallic shriek tore through the cabin, instantly followed by the terrifying realization: the starboard inner engine burst into flames. Fuel lines were ruptured, hydraulics were bleeding out, and the fuselage was not just peppered with shrapnel, the rear section was shredded, leaving jagged holes open to the rushing wind. The Texas Terror lived up to its name, becoming a crippled, burning monstrosity. The descent into crisis. Sumners wrestled the wounded behemoth out of the tight formation. To remain in the box was to risk colliding with a neighboring plane or spraying the formation with flame. He forced the stick forward, initiating a shallow, controlled dive to gain airspeed and distance from the flak zone. The cockpit was a maelstrom of activity and sound. The flight engineer was frantically trying to feather the burning engine, while the gunners were shouting reports of damage and the navigator desperately sought a course change. The aircraft was rapidly losing altitude and control. The fire, fed by aviation gasoline, was threatening to consume the wing structure. The conventional decision in this terminal situation was taught to every man in the 8th Air Force as gospel: abandon ship. The flight engineer confirmed the damage was catastrophic. Sumner's options, as dictated by standard military protocol, were limited to survival. Bail out immediately over the coast of France, with the slim hope of connecting with the French resistance and making the long, dangerous journey to Spain. Attempt to ditch the plane in the English Channel, the freezing waters giving the crew a few minutes of life to wait for rescue services. Attempt an emergency landing in neutral territory, such as Switzerland or Sweden, which guaranteed internment but also guaranteed safety. The crew, knowing the drill, began the agonizing process of preparing their parachutes. The emergency buzzer was armed, and faces were pale beneath the oxygen masks. They were ready for the jump, ready to trade the terror of the sky for the terror of the ground. The unspoken order, but Lieutenant Sumners carried a different weight, a different, higher command. He was the only man in that screaming metal cabin who knew that his mission had not ended when the bombs fell, nor when the flak hit. The confidential piece of equipment he carried, a prototype guidance system, was so sensitive and so crucial to the planning of the upcoming invasion of Europe that its capture by the Germans was deemed a greater strategic catastrophe than the loss of the entire crew and the B-24 itself. Sumner's had received a unique, verbal briefing from High Command, a directive only shared with a select few pilots. If capture is imminent, or if the aircraft is lost over enemy territory, the immediate and overriding priority is the destruction of the asset and the verification of its total destruction. The conventional decision, bailing out, would scatter the crew and leave the wrecked B-24 uncontrolled, likely spreading the vital, classified wreckage across miles of terrain. The chance of the Germans finding an intact piece of the device, or reconstructing it from fragments, was too high. Sumner's needed to contain the wreckage. He needed the device consolidated in one place. He needed a controlled landing. Sumner's looked down at the rapidly approaching coastline. The English Channel, the route to safety and the expected ditching zone, was visible to his right. But his eyes were fixed on the tapestry of fields, and small, isolated farmhouses deep into the enemy-controlled fields of France. He chose his landing spot carefully, a wide, open stretch of land, far from major roads, but close enough to ensure a rapid German response. It was a decision born of absolute military logic, yet one that required a chilling disregard for personal survival. Sumner's had committed to a secret mission far more vital than the survival of his aircraft or his crew. He chose to fly his plane, and the lives of 10 men, toward certain capture to ensure a single piece of metal did not fall into enemy hands. He had ignored the conventional escape routes. He had dismissed the hope of survival behind friendly lines. Lieutenant Sumner's adjusted the throttle on his remaining engines, settling his wounded Liberator into a deliberate descent, a straight, one-way vector deep into the heart of the Third Reich's domain. The fateful flight was ending, but the true, desperate mission was just beginning. The confidential equipment strapped down in a heavily secured compartment near the navigator's station was no ordinary piece of gear. It was a prototype radio transponder, the cutting edge of Allied guidance and navigation technology. In the mid-1940s, such electronics were bulky, fragile, and utterly revolutionary. This specific device was destined for use in the future D-Day landings, less than a year away, when hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of ships would need to coordinate their movements across a hostile, dark sea. The transponder was designed to emit a complex, encrypted signal that would allow Allied ships and aircraft to pinpoint their precise locations and navigate through the inevitable chaos of the invasion. It was the linchpin of the entire logistical plan. If this technology fell into German hands, if their scientists were able to decode its function, copy its design, or even just identify the frequency it used, the consequence was unthinkable. The entire invasion plan, Operation Overlord, could be compromised. The Germans would be able to jam the signal, rendering Allied navigation useless, or, worse, use the signal to create a deadly trap, guiding the invasion fleet to a pre-sighted kill zone. The loss of the transponder was not merely a military setback, it was a potential strategic catastrophe that could cost hundreds of thousands of lives and perhaps lose the war in the West. Sumner's briefing had been delivered with chilling solemnity: do not let the technology be captured intact. The moment the flak hit, Sumner's thought process became a frantic, high-speed calculation, weighing human life against strategic imperative. He knew the reality of an uncontrolled bomber crash. If he ordered his crew to bail out, the B-24, already spiraling out of control, would become a giant, tumbling missile. It would likely break apart upon impact with the ground, scattering the crucial technology across a wide, unpredictable area. A crash site that stretched for miles would make the complete, verified destruction of the device almost impossible for any subsequent Allied forces, or even local resistance units, to accomplish. More critically, it would give the meticulous German salvage crews ample time and territory to sift through the pieces and eventually reconstruct the transponder's secrets. Destruction was the goal, but given the circumstances, relying on a chaotic accident was too great a risk. Sumner's mission was clear: he had to maintain control over the ultimate fate of the classified equipment. This grim calculation led Sumner's to the most audacious and terrifying conclusion. If he could not secure the device through normal means, he would execute the backup plan: a controlled crash landing. A controlled landing, however brutal, meant the wreckage would be consolidated. The plane would skid to a stop in one localized spot, allowing Sumner's, the man who knew the device's location and the key to its self-destruct mechanism, to reach it immediately. His commitment went further than mere destruction. He needed to verify its destruction. He needed to see the device reduced to an unrecognizable mass of slag and ruined circuitry. Only then, with the knowledge that the secret was safe, could he consider the fate of himself and his crew. The controlled crash landing transformed Sumner's role from an escaping victim of war to an active agent fulfilling a final, critical objective. He was knowingly flying his aircraft into the clutches of the enemy, not out of desperation, but out of strategic necessity. He chose a wide field far from immediate towns, a spot that promised a softer impact and, crucially, ensured a swift and localized capture by German forces shortly after landing. This was the final, terrible piece of the plan: ensure capture to ensure the secret remained buried in the wreckage. The decision was agonizing, yet instantaneous. He spoke into the interphone, his voice steady despite the noise, delivering an order that must have sounded like insanity to his frightened crew. "Ditch the chutes. I repeat, ditch your parachutes and brace for impact. We are landing this bird." The response was likely momentary confusion, followed by the shock of comprehension. Ditching the parachutes was a final, terrible commitment. It stripped the crew of their last chance at freedom or survival outside the aircraft. Sumner's ensured that when they hit the ground, they were all together, within the confines of the wreckage, where he could maintain command and focus on the primary target. The crew was forced to choose between the terror of a sudden, chaotic jump into the unknown and the equally terrifying certainty of a controlled, bone-jarring crash into occupied France, followed immediately by capture. But they trusted the Texan. They obeyed. The men ditched their parachutes and scrambled to their crash positions. The B-24 Liberator, the Texas Terror, now became a guided missile, its final target not a military installation, but a predetermined field in enemy territory. Sumner's was landing deep in enemy territory, on purpose. He had chosen mission over self, the strategic fate of the invasion over the immediate lives of his men. The air was thick with smoke, adrenaline, and the chilling realization that they had just traded the chaos of the sky for the certainty of a German prison camp, all to save a secret that no one but Sumner's could fully comprehend. The descent was underway, a 7-ton engine of American sacrifice heading for its final, planned destination. Sumner's skill, honed over hundreds of hours of combat flying, was now put to the ultimate test. He was flying a 4-engine bomber with only 2 engines responding and a third on fire, its control surfaces sluggish and unresponsive due to hydraulic damage. As he skimmed low over the French countryside, the ground rushing up at terrifying speed, he had to perform a grim ballet of aviation. He lined the plane up on a wide, relatively clear field, avoiding the wooded areas and the lethal obstacles of farmhouses and stone walls. With immense effort, he managed to cut the remaining engines, a crucial step to prevent them from ripping free and cartwheeling the aircraft upon impact. The massive, heavy Liberator transitioned from powered flight to an immense glider, dropping toward the earth. The landing gear was not deployed. The sheer shock of hitting the ground with wheels down would have instantly torn the wing spars apart and likely fractured the fuselage, once again risking the scattering of the classified equipment. Sumner's executed a perfect belly landing. The sound of the impact was deafening, a prolonged, tearing screech of stressed metal against earth. The B-24, the Texas Terror, tore through hedges and ditches, acting like a giant, metal plow. Mud, earth, and debris exploded around the fuselage as it skidded. For a terrifying, prolonged moment, the plane seemed intent on disintegrating. Then, with an agonizing shudder and a final groan of buckling aluminum, the bomber skidded to a stop. Silence descended, broken only by the hiss of cooling metal and the low crackle of the lingering wing fire. The wreckage was surprisingly intact. The fuselage had held. The compartmentalized area containing the secret was secured. Miraculous survival and immediate action. The interior of the cockpit was a mess of loose gear, twisted instrumentation, and spent adrenaline. But miraculously, all 10 crew members survived the landing. They were bruised, battered, and stunned into temporary silence, but alive. There was no time for congratulations. No time for relief. Sumner's voice, sharp and commanding despite the ringing in his ears, immediately sliced through the shock. Damage party, navigator, security, everyone else, prepare for disposal. Sumner's internal clock was already counting down. He knew the protocol of the German military. Flak bursts were immediately reported, and any subsequent crash landing would have triggered an automatic dispatch of German patrols, likely elements of the Wehrmacht or local Luftwaffe security detachments, who would be on them within minutes. Every second counted not for their escape, but for the final, critical objective. Sumner's, moving with a speed and focus born of relentless training, was the first out of the wreckage. He scrambled to the bomb bay area, where the most sensitive cargo was stored. The detonation. Destroying the future. He immediately located the transponder device. It was heavy, complex, and still recognizable, a cabinet full of vacuum tubes, coils, and wiring that represented the technological keys to Operation Overlord. He did not hesitate. He directed his navigator to assist in dragging the device clear of the main wreckage. From the inner pocket of his reinforced flight suit, Sumner's produced his insurance policy, a small packet of high explosives, likely a plastic composition charge, already fitted with a short fuse and detonator. This had been secured to his person since briefing, a final, sacred tool of his mission. With the device laid bare on the muddy French soil, Sumner's placed the charge precisely against the most sensitive electronic components, ensuring maximum thermal and physical damage. He secured the detonator and, pulling the lanyard, ignited the fuse. He barked the order, "Clear the area. Fire in the hole." The crew, instantly recognizing the explosive threat, scrambled away. The blast that followed was sharp, concussive, and loud. It was not the massive explosion of an ammo dump, but a concentrated, violent burst designed for localized destruction. Sumner's rushed back to the blast site. His eyes scanned the result. The sophisticated guidance system was gone. In its place was nothing more than an unrecognizable pile of slag, ash, and fused aluminum. The heat was intense, the destruction total. The essential circuits were melted, the vacuum tubes vaporized. The verification of destruction was complete. The Allied invasion plan was secure. The final deliberate acts. With the primary objective achieved, Sumner's moved to the secondary goal, ensuring the Germans gained no intelligence whatsoever from the airframe or the crew's flight documentation. He moved into the cockpit. He produced a second, smaller device, an incendiary thermite packet, used for document destruction. He ignited the packet and placed it among the flight boards, navigation logs, and the highly sensitive map cases that contained the day's flight plan and the bomber's target lists. The thermite fire was fast, localized, and intensely hot, quickly reducing all remaining sensitive documents to carbon and ash. Now, with the physical evidence destroyed, the psychological part of the mission began. Sumner's assembled his crew. They were moments away from capture. Their next action had to be perfectly staged to deceive the enemy. They had to appear as typical, escaping airmen, terrified and focused on survival, not intelligence work. They ran, but they did not run toward a hope of freedom. They ran away from the wreck, specifically toward a nearby copse of trees, ensuring they left clear tracks that would lead any German patrol away from the immediate blast site of the destroyed transponder. They were creating a perfect distraction, deliberately focusing their inevitable captors on the chase rather than the wreckage. Lieutenant Sumner's knew the clock had run out on their freedom. But the mission had succeeded. He had successfully traded 10 American lives for the absolute safety of the secrets of the entire Western Front. He was flying a B-24, but he was executing an espionage operation, and the final, successful move was the controlled surrender. The goal of the frantic scramble away from the crash site was never to achieve freedom. Sumner's knew, with grim certainty, that escape deep inside occupied France with 10 men, many of them injured and conspicuous in their flight gear, was a statistical impossibility. The objective was purely psychological and tactical. Sumner's and his men plunged into a nearby woods, a thicket offering immediate concealment. They moved with the urgency of escaping men, leaving behind the necessary clues, broken branches, scuffed earth, and the remnants of discarded emergency gear. This brief evasion was a calculated ruse, a vital piece of the performance that had to look genuine. They remained hidden for several hours, the time necessary for the initial German security sweep to secure the crash site and begin their hunt for the airmen. As they huddled in the damp undergrowth, the crew's exhaustion began to set in. The sheer shock of the crash landing, combined with the extreme adrenaline of the fire and the detonation, left them drained. They were tired, bruised, and desperately low on water and supplies. Their survival kits, designed for quick evasion, offered little comfort for a long, arduous trek. This period of waiting was not simply about resting, it was about creating a false narrative. Sumners needed the Germans to arrive at the wreckage and see a chaotic scene, a destroyed plane, signs of explosion within the cockpit from the incendiary, and clear evidence that the crew's priority was a panicked escape. By delaying their surrender, Sumners was ensuring that the German immediate focus would shift entirely to personnel retrieval. The logic was sound. If the crew had stayed by the plane, the enemy might have been highly suspicious of their calm demeanor and immediately focused on what they were trying to protect. By fleeing, the airmen confirmed the German default expectation, that a downed enemy crew's singular priority is survival and evasion. The deliberate delay ensured that the pursuing German forces believed the airmen were the primary target, not the inconspicuous, fused lump of metal that was once the transponder. The brief hunt for the missing crew would preoccupy the German unit, taking their attention away from a meticulous, microscopic examination of the blast zone near the navigator's station. The inevitable discovery. As planned, the delay was minimal. As the sun climbed higher, the Germans began to tighten the ring around the woods. This area was not a vast wilderness, it was occupied French countryside, and a unit of 10 foreign airmen could not simply melt away. Within a few hours, a carefully calibrated period that allowed the Germans enough time to focus on the chase, but not enough time to coordinate a massive dragnet, the crew was discovered. It was a unit of the German army, the Wehrmacht, whose patrol had been diverted from local security duties to round up the downed flyers. The moment of discovery was devoid of drama. There was no intense firefight, no desperate chase. Sumners had instructed his men, do not resist. Do not struggle, your job is finished. The tired, injured crew simply rose from the undergrowth, their hands raised. The German soldiers, young and tense, approached with rifles raised. The surrender was a moment of stark contrast. Instead of chaos, they found order. Lieutenant Sumners stepped forward. He moved with a practiced, military composure that immediately struck the German officers as unusual. He was not trembling, he was not begging. He was a professional, executing a final military duty. He calmly identified himself as the first lieutenant and the highest-ranking officer present. He then formally surrendered his crew according to the accepted rules of land warfare. The German officers, hardened veterans accustomed to the terror and chaos of combat, were initially suspicious. They were surprised not only by the rapid surrender but by the sheer composure and the relative lack of severe injury among the captured airmen. Most crews who crash-landed were a mess of broken bones and psychological distress. Sumner's men, though exhausted, were disciplined and quiet. This was exactly the reaction Sumners had engineered. The Germans were left to grapple with an unexplained puzzle. Why were these flyers so calm? Why did they surrender so easily? The answer, according to Sumner's fabricated narrative, was that he was a highly disciplined officer who valued the lives of his crew above all else and chose the most controlled, least risky method of survival, even if it meant capture. The mystery of their composure helped to solidify the lie. The mission had been a failure, and the pilot's only concern now was the safety of his men. The true, terrifying secret that had driven the entire maneuver, the destruction of the transponder, remained buried, literally and figuratively, at the crash site, far from the attention of the now satisfied German captors. The first phase of the mission was over. The B-24 was lost, the secret was safe, and Lieutenant Sumners and his men were officially prisoners of war, exactly where they needed to be to avoid accidentally revealing the truth. The next, long war would be fought not with aircraft and flak, but with words and silence. Sumners and his crew were quickly separated and transported from the quiet French countryside to a dedicated German interrogation facility, likely a Luftwaffe intelligence annex. The Germans were masters of this psychological warfare, employing specialized teams of interrogators whose job was to exploit exhaustion, confusion, and fear to break the enemy airmen. German intelligence officers, often highly educated, fluent in English, and armed with detailed knowledge of Allied aircraft and airbase routines, were desperate for information. In 1944, the Wehrmacht was battling a relentless stream of Allied intelligence derived from intercepted communications and spy networks. Capturing 10 American airmen, particularly one whose bomber had executed such an unusual landing maneuver, was considered a significant haul. The first priority for the Germans was to reconstruct the mission of the Texas Terror. Why that target? Which route? Where were the other planes? And, most importantly, what was the true reason for the controlled crash? Extreme, localized destruction. The area around the cockpit and the navigator's station showed signs of a small, intense explosion and fire, far more than a simple crash would cause. The interior was scorched, maps were burned to ash, and a section of the floor near the navigation equipment was fused and unrecognizable. Missing parachutes. The fact that 10 parachutes were accounted for as ditched or missing was a massive red flag. Why would a crew ditch its only means of escape if not commanded to do so? Perfect landing. The skill required for the belly landing, minimizing crew casualties and preserving the airframe structure, indicated a deliberate, not accidental, act. The Germans concluded correctly that the crash landing was intentional. Their immediate assumption, however, was that Sumner's must have been carrying sensitive maps, documents, or high-ranking personnel that he was trying to prevent from falling into their hands. They searched the slag and ash with feverish attention, certain they would find the remnants of a destroyed radar or bombing computer. Crucially, because Sumner's had used the powerful, localized explosion of high explosives instead of a simple fire, the transponder was reduced to a state that was technically indecipherable. It looked like the aftermath of a severe electrical fire or battle damage, not a precision sabotage. The German experts could confirm something important had been destroyed, but the object itself was too pulverized for forensic reconstruction. Lieutenant Sumner's was the key. Isolated, cold, and exhausted, he entered the interrogation room ready to deploy his prepared cover story, a narrative so simple and logical that it would withstand intense scrutiny. Sumner's cover story: my primary engine was destroyed by accurate flak. With the fire out of control, bailing out would have scattered my crew and risked them falling into hostile hands without support. As the commanding officer, my duty was to secure the safety of my men. I chose the controlled crash landing to keep my crew consolidated and minimize injuries, thereby ensuring their best chance of survival under the rules of the Geneva Convention. Surrender was the most disciplined and responsible choice. He stuck rigidly to this story, repeating it verbatim, refusing to embellish or add extraneous detail that could be tripped up later. Every time the interrogator pivoted to the destroyed equipment, Sumner's deflected. What were you carrying that required that much fire? Only standard navigation logs, destroyed to prevent the enemy from learning our route. Why did you force the destruction of the aircraft's nose section? It was damaged in the flak. The heat from the fire spread rapidly. His strategy was pure misdirection. He offered the Germans an acceptable, logical truth that was highly compatible with his observed behavior: discipline, control, crew welfare, distracting them from the far more complex and dangerous true secret. Sumner's composure was his greatest weapon. He was not evasive, which often signals a lie, he was simply disciplined. His calmness, which had initially surprised the Wehrmacht captors, now reinforced the narrative for the intelligence officers. He came across not as a panicked spy, but as a highly skilled, fundamentally straightforward bomber pilot driven by the highest standards of military duty. The German interrogators, convinced of their own acumen, began to conclude that Sumner's bravery was simply a matter of military preference. He preferred the risk of capture to the chaos of bailing out. They saw his actions as an expression of Prussian-like discipline, a quality they understood and respected. This false conclusion was the final triumph of Sumner's deception. The Germans were confident in their assessment. The mission had been a failed bombing run, the plane carried nothing strategically unique, and the pilot was merely a fanatic for order. They focused on extracting generic intelligence, targets, formations, airbase strength, failing entirely to grasp the immense strategic value of the single item that Sumner's had sacrificed his freedom to destroy. Sumner's military discipline and supreme acting had successfully obscured the true objective, the destruction of the transponder and the verification of that destruction, ensuring that the secret remained an absolute secret. The safety of the D-Day landings rested on the strength of Sumner's silence and his conviction, a heavy burden that he carried alone into the darkness of the German prison camp system.